I'm Ken, and I've spent a lot of years looking at climate ethics. In particular, the way in which climate change compounds environmental valuation, environmental values, and sustainable development. And I'm always looking for different conceptual lenses. I'm a philosopher, after all. I like conceptual frameworks. And vulnerability turns out to be, I think, an incredibly useful framework. Now, the trick, if we had a lot longer, would be to sit and talk amongst ourselves and figure out what we mean by vulnerability, because it's interestingly ambiguous. It means a lot to everyone in this room, I'm betting, and it'll mean different things. And I think that if we think about vulnerability more carefully, though, it'll provide some really interesting insights into what I think will turn out to be a different way of understanding climate adaptation. It's a long stretch, but I've got 7 minutes, or 6.5. So we'll see how it goes at this point. I think that vulnerability can be a good thing, and systemic vulnerability generally provides a means of thinking differently about our relationship with the systems in which we're embedded, and provides a means of actually, I think, connecting to the more than human world, tying together the various themes of stuff that I work on over the years. But I'd like to start by thinking about this place. This is Adaptation. It's a small town just to the east of Accra, right by the mouth of the Volta. And I led a group here during a semester at sea excursion in the fall of 19. It's an estuary, and it's a perfect place for a fishery. The mouth of the Volta, there's a flow of nutrients that comes off the coast, but that flow of nutrients also comes right past Accra. So we were visiting this place, and the local fisher was guiding us through the removal of nets. We were drawing in nets with them. An extraordinarily hot day for me. It was just laden with plastic. The net was just like a filtration device for all of the plastic that comes down the Volta and runs across the store. The sand is saturated with plastic. And the fisher who was there clearly expressed some concerns about well-being, about the capacity to pull the net up. It was heavier than usual. About the future of the economic viability of fishing, about health and well-being, about anxiety over the future and the prospects of living here. And the anxiety was shaped by a different set of concerns. Let's see where this is going. Concerns over the ecology of this particular estuary, concerns about the economy that's dependent on the ecology, concerns about the society that's dependent on the economy that's dependent on the ecology, concerns about the politics of the area dependent on the society and the economy and the ecology. Turtles all the way down. The challenge is that these systems were all fundamentally interrelated. And behind this is this challenge, that there are two different ways of thinking about vulnerability, and it's hard sometimes, in all of the ambiguities and variabilities and vulnerability, to sometimes keep it all straight. But it was pretty straight in this fisher's idea. There were worries that he had about his future well-being and the individual harms he was subject to, and there were worries about the systems and whether they could bounce back from the perturbations that might be expected from pollution and all of the harbingers of the Anthropocene. So, what I'd like to do now is to think a little bit, and shift gears a tiny bit in this short time I have, to think a little bit about the way in which individual vulnerability and systemic vulnerability can be mutually reinforcing. Because like I said, individual vulnerability generally looks like something that's bad. It's something you worry about. It's almost analytic. Here's the philosopher again. Insofar as harm is a bad thing, almost by definition, and insofar as vulnerability is defined as susceptibility to harm, vulnerability therefore seems to be the kind of thing one should mitigate, get rid of. Now, that's a terrible idea. I mean, after all, what does vulnerability do besides that? Well, it also gives us things like love and friendship and, well, all the things that make human life human. And that seems to be important. And after all, look again at this picture. I mean, this isn't like Captain Ahab alone facing down the great white whale, right? What he's doing, what this is, it's a community. There's a whole bunch of people who are interacting on these boats. No one goes in a canoe alone. The vulnerability to one another, the sociality that's there, is something enabled by vulnerability. Vulnerability isn't all bad. Vulnerability makes things possible. And we can say something similar when it comes to systemic vulnerability as well. Now, the literature that I find myself ensconced in most of the time is the climate change literature. And in this case, people are really worried, desperately worried about the way in which different kinds of pressures of climate change give rise to compromised ecosystems, compromised economies, compromised politics, compromised everything. The systems look like they're a problem. And so that's the presumption. But this presumption, as you'd guess, by argument of parity, I'm a philosopher after all, turns out to be deeply problematic as well. So here's the thought. Just join me if you will. We're in this room where I'm sure an information technology specialist has spent a lot of time worrying about how things might collapse. They're desperately trying to make sure this information environment, the system of information technology, is intact. It's fully functional. It's invulnerable, one would hope. So if vulnerability is a bad thing, then invulnerability should be a good thing. So imagine with me, if you will, what would be an entirely invulnerable system? An information system, excuse me. I got it. It's this. It's a book on a desk, alone, in a locked room, unable to be accessed, totally useless, functionally inert, dead. Now, if that's the case, and I'm just going to go on a limb here and presume that we think that's a bad thing, that tells us that vulnerability and vulnerability don't track good and bad very well, which means there's a possibility for good things to come out of systemic vulnerability in the same way good things come out of individual vulnerability. And the underlying issue with vulnerability isn't harm or system resilience, it's exposure. And exposure can go well or poorly. And keeping track of the underlying concern, how we're exposed, looks like it's just about as important. This is how climate change adaptation literature should go and is moving in that direction. That just as in the case vulnerability allows for openness of individuals, so vulnerability allows for the adaptation of systems. They work exactly the same way. Just as the individual isolated alone is not much of a human, with all due respect, the systems themselves, by themselves, are no better than a book, isolated and alone. Mutual adaptation is our goal. How is it that the systems that are interwoven one with another might develop over time? As this estuary changes, as the background climate change works, nesting our ecology and our economy and our politic and the livelihood of individuals is the future. And that's the way to structure adaptation strategies, mutual adaptation across these different levels and contexts of vulnerability. The virtues of exposure provide us with the lemonade, the positive ways of thinking about the responses to climate change. As the world changes around us and the need to adapt becomes more and more pronounced, how can we not be more connected to the environment? If we realize the interdependencies of our systems and ourselves and our livelihoods, the future of vulnerability research, the future of adaptation, it goes with mutual adaptation. It's recognizing our nestedness. This is the way forward that's practical, that's ethical, and that's hopeful. Thank you very much.